It's great to have so many people with us this evening, and welcome. For those of you who haven't been to any of the climate forums before or need a refresher, Zero Carbon Harrogate is a voluntary organisation, and our objective is to drive the Harrogate district to being carbon neutral by 2030. We're really excited to have just recently set out our, this isn't going to work, is it? Because we've got a funny screen, a vision document and strategy, which many of you will have seen, or you can go to our website. Kirsty is kindly showing hers. We feel it's really important for people to grasp what a zero carbon economy might look like for our towns, for our villages, for the rural areas across the district. And so we set out some of that vision and our priorities for the next year as an organisation in that document. So do please have a look at that. This evening, we are really delighted to have two extremely knowledgeable and influential scientists on our come to speak to us, and they are both Harrogate residents as well. So it's really lovely to have people who know our area and are doing top level climate science. So we're going to hear first from Professor Piers Forster and then to Professor Andy Shepherd. So some of you will know Piers, maybe you've had the opportunity to hear him before, but let me remind you that Piers is an atmospheric physicist. He's the director of the Priestley International Climate Centre at Leeds University. And he, as well as conducting his own research and being busy in the at Leeds University, he has set up a forestry protection and research charity, the United Bank of Carbon, which again you may have come across, definitely worth looking at their website. And he advises on a range of different panels, including the UK Climate Change Committee. And going up a notch, he has also been the coordinating lead author on two, is it, Piers, or three of the four of the IPCC reports. So Piers does know his climate change, and I've probably missed out some other amazing things that he does too, because he does quite a lot. I'm going to hand straight over to Piers.
Yeah, okay, everyone. Good evening. I do hope we're all enjoying ourselves. I will just try and put up my document to see if this works, and then we can hopefully begin. So can you tell me if that is now kind of working? What can people see?
I can.
It's there, Piers.
Good.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, it's working.
Okay. So yeah, thanks for the introduction, Jemima, and it's always good to see people from working the town that are really trying to make a difference. So I want to say can thank you for everyone's work they're doing. We have to get there together, and we have to get there collectively. So everything that everyone does is very important. So I thought I would begin with this quite depressing picture from the California wildfires in August. And of course, this is the impacts of climate change we're experiencing today. But I sort of wanted to inject a bit of optimism into my talk this evening. And the first thing I wanted to say is that the current climate policies they're really beginning to work. So we were probably on target for a temperature change somewhere north of 4 degrees above pre-industrial times, but we have effectively got ourselves off that degree of temperature change, and we're probably somewhere now above 2.5 or 3 degrees of temperature change. Of course, with that temperature change, we do still experience quite devastating impacts, but they aren't as bad as they would have been. And of course, what we'll be talking about today is what we can do to do even better than that currently, to get us down to well below 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees. So we are beginning to make a difference to our society, and we have the opportunity to go even kind of further than that. And I want to talk to you about some of my own technical work that I've been doing, in fact, with this, trying to understand some of the possible effects of climate interventions. And there was some work I did with my 18-year-old daughter while she was locked down, and she didn't have anything to do. She couldn't do her exams, so I kind of put her to work. And I put her to work trying to investigate what would be the climate impact of COVID-19 restrictions. So what we did together was try and collect this information that was published from Google to look at the effects around the world of different levels of pollution. And we put all of this data together, and we estimated that levels of carbon dioxide dropped to about just below 30% from where they would have been otherwise, and they are currently at about 15% below where they would have been without COVID-19. And you can of course see effectively from this immediately the benefit on air quality and pollution. So this shows a satellite image of pollution over China, and you can see that it almost effectively disappeared. Unfortunately, it has really got back now to where it was before, but for a bit it completely disappeared. But what I wanted to do was some more technical work to try and look at the effect of these emission changes on surface temperature. I do apologize for the diagram, it's quite kind of technical, but I thought I really wanted to try and explain some of the technical things that are going on. And I thought if my 18-year-old daughter is now turned into an artist, can understand this diagram, and I'm sure everyone on this call can as well. So the first thing that we did find was going on is how the temperature change over the next 10 years we can predict. It is we expect increase in the surface temperature, and that's from reduction in pollution from coal, SO2, and that is actually lead to less sunlight being reflected from that pollution, and that gives you an increase in surface temperature change. But that is almost completely countered by the effects of aircraft contrails. So the aircraft contrails, those the kind of lines of ice cloud we do see, they have disappeared, or quite a lot of them have disappeared, and that has led to a reduction in surface temperature that is just contemporary for when we don't see the contrails. We also see a reduction in temperature from traffic pollution. That gives you a short-term decrease in temperature, but all these effects I describe only operate in the kind of short term, and really the only kind of long-term effect that persists for 10 years from this 1 or 2 year change does come from the long-term effect of carbon dioxide, because that does last for a long time, and although it only comes down a little bit from the restrictions, it does give you a bit of a longer term reduction. And this tells us that to try and really make a significant change, you don't only have to reduce carbon dioxide temporarily for a significant amount, you have to reduce it permanently, and you have to reduce it not just a bit, you have to reduce it all the way to zero. So this is why we have our net zero ambitions, because to prevent it causing an increase in temperature, we have to get it all the way to zero. But there are some interesting things going on. So the different changes we saw, they weren't just from change in behaviour. There was actually some more significant things going on, and this shows you the change in energy generation, and you can see from this diagram that in fact there were some environmentally friendly things going on in the different countries. So most countries preferentially stopped their coal-fired power stations and stopped burning oil, and they did a shift of energy into renewables. So it wasn't just people not using as much energy, they did make choices about which energy they would produce, and they did preferentially choose renewables. So what we wanted to have a look at with this work is really what would it take to turn what we've experienced into a green recovery. And so we did some economic calculations to look at what it would cost to change the trajectory of the global emission pathway. So this diagram does show the historic emissions in carbon dioxide, and then this shows the decrease we've experienced from COVID-19. And we just did some trajectories where we had one where we just went back to what we were doing before, and we had some where we spent some money on trying to invest in a green recovery. And it's interesting, the first thing is to tell that it is not an expensive investment. In fact, what you have to do for the entire Earth isn't much more expensive than what we just spent on COVID-19 in the UK. So that is the level of investment we are talking about to really affect this recovery. So it's not very big at all. But so what we wanted to go through and look at what this would do to the surface temperature. And what I want you to get from this diagram is that you can really begin to make a material difference to the well surface temperature if you do these green recovery type kind of policies. So our calculation did potentially indicate you could perhaps end up with a surface temperature really below 2 degrees, and perhaps even aim for 1.5 degrees potentially. So that gives us some encouragement. So I thought it'd be interesting tonight to perhaps discuss some of the opportunities around recovering from the COVID-19 lockdown, and there have been changes in behaviour, and perhaps they can persist, and perhaps it will eventually get our governments to be more kind of cooperative and to work together. But I think we have to worry about what are the kind of downsides, and perhaps people aren't going to trust experts or trust government advice as much as they could have done, and perhaps people will move to suburbia, which might make the emissions go up, of course. So we have to think very, very carefully about the way it might change people's behaviour. And yeah, wait a minute, so I'm not on the right slide now. Wait a minute. Oh, it's not working. How do I go forward? Okay, good. Wait a minute. Yeah, okay. But I want to end my talk by thinking we're at a very exciting time in the discussions. I mean, we are currently in charge of the United Nations negotiations for this big important climate meeting next November, and on the Committee on Climate Change, which I'm part of, we are going to publish our recommendation for the sixth carbon budget, and that will include our recommendation for our nationally determined contribution, which is the level of emission reduction we want over the next 10 years. And then on the 12th of December, not long after that, we expect the UK government will hopefully go with our recommendation, and potentially they're also trying to coordinate announcements from the EU and from China. So potentially we might see a big increase of ambition from these countries at the same time. But why I'm excited to talk to you guys today is that for the next emission changes over the next 10 years, the government can't do it without your local support, but because it isn't just about reducing coal and building wind turbines. A lot of the things we have to do today to really affect people, and people will have to make their choices. So we have to give people the opportunity to make choices and to really change. So people have to make green choices for the way they drive and the way they get on bicycles, the way they insulate their properties, and where they plant trees and what they buy and things. So we somehow have to affect the education and that change in behaviour together. So that's the end of my talk. I hope I didn't talk for too much time.
Thank you, Piers. I was going to say it's always a pleasure. Certainly didn't go on for too long.
I'm very sorry, Andy.
And it's good to see that some questions are coming in to the chat box. We're going to just hold the questions for the moment until we've heard Andy speak, and then Kirsty is going to manage the questions that are coming in and some that have been submitted beforehand as well. So let me just introduce Andrew to you. Andrew is sorry, I'll start again. Oh, Andrew's getting his slides up. Fantastic. Andrew is an astrophysicist, and his expertise is in satellite remote sensing of the cryosphere, with a particular emphasis on the quantitative techniques of radio interferometry and radio altimetry, and I'm hoping he might be able to tell us a little bit more about what that actually means. He's currently at the University of Leeds, having worked his way through the University of Leicester, University College London, Cambridge and Edinburgh along the way on his career, and as well as being involved in quite a number of different organisations and bodies. For those of us who are not technical scientists, we might recognise his advice to the broadcasting of various BBC documentaries such that he's advised on Blue Planet 2 degrees and David Attenborough's Climate Change, The Facts. So again, we are very fortunate to have Andrew with us, and I will hand over to him now.
Good evening. Can you hear my audio?
Yes, that's good.
Great. Okay, thanks very much for the introduction. Apologies for those words of jargon in terms of my speciality. I basically, earlier satellites didn't do. And the second thing it does is have a dual radar on top of it, which allows it to monitor the ice in a way that previous missions couldn't do. And I'm the principal scientist for this mission, and it's been in space since 2010, so about a decade. And I'll show you some measurements that we've collected from Cryosat and some other satellite missions along the way, which tell us about how Antarctica and Greenland are changing, and then talk about why that matters to us, and indeed even us in Yorkshire. As you heard, I live in Harrogate as well, and it will matter for us, as it will for most people in most parts of the world, because people access, for one reason or other, coastlines. So this little presentation should be fairly lowbrow. It's about a project that I run on behalf of the European Space Agency and NASA, called the Ice Sheet Mass Balancing Comparison Exercise. It's been running for about a decade, and it's really the global assessment of ice loss from Antarctica and Greenland. So it's got about 100 different scientists involved in it, and we've been reporting along the way in magazine-type journals. But we got the front cover of Time magazine earlier on this year, which was really nice. This is a graphic, an artist's impression of climate change through various data sets. Jill Pelto drew it for the cover of a special issue on the climate emergency, and they used our data to represent ice losses from Antarctica and Greenland, which was really nice. And I've got a framed copy of this on my wall now because it was a really nice thing to happen. It just happened out of the blue. So this is the first thing that we can measure from space. It's the speed of the glaciers in Antarctica. The brightly coloured areas are the patterns of ice flow, and they flow like rivers. Even though it's one large chunk of ice, there are faster flowing parts amongst the ice sheet, and they drain the ice into the oceans. So the ice flows down here slower than rivers. It takes probably about 1,000 years for a particle of ice to flow through one of these glaciers and end up in the ocean. So it's really a long-term repository of climate change over I guess millenniums, and if we see changes happening today, it means that the ice sheet's out of balance with the climate system, and that's a concern, because we expected, before we had detailed satellite measurements, we expected the ice sheet to really be not responsive to climate change, because it's pretty cold at the poles. It's about -40 degrees on average throughout the year, and should take a lot of heat to warm them up. And in the early years of the IPCC, the predictions were in fact that the ice sheets would grow in a warming climate, because if all else was equal, warming air temperatures lead to more rain and in the polar regions that falls as snow. So this is the second. Can you hear this audio?
Yeah.
So this is the second satellite technique we have, and it's called the GRACE satellite mission. And it's a pair of satellites which are flying around in space behind one another, and they measure their distance apart. And what that allows them to do is to actually measure Earth's gravitational field really precisely. And by doing that, they can weigh changes in Earth's ice beneath them. And this is a picture, one picture of that in Greenland, of the weight change of Greenland during the satellite's mission. And then we have a third technique, which is the one that I specialize in, and that's using altimeters in space, which measure their height above the Earth's surface, just like an aeroplane would. But if you do that repeatedly over time, and you know where you are in space, as the satellites do, because they have other sensors on board, they can actually measure the change in height of Earth's surface. And Antarctica is thinning, particularly in this part of West Antarctica. The glaciers are thinning really quite rapidly. Over the past 20 or 30 years, these glaciers have thinned by about 200 meters. And that's pouring ice into the oceans. And so all of these satellite techniques can be combined together to paint a picture of how Greenland and Antarctica have changed over the past 30 or so years. And that's what we do. We add them all together, and we produce some really simple charts of the sea level contribution due to polar ice sheets. So this is one of those charts, 1995 to 2015, I guess. And it's measuring the ice loss but converted into sea level rise, so up to 20 millimeters. So Antarctica, over the past 20 years, has caused about 7 millimeters of sea level rise. Greenland's caused about 10 millimeters of sea level rise. And the two ice sheets together are about 15, 16, 17 centimeters of sea level, millimeters, should I say, of sea level rise, which doesn't sound a lot at all. Just over a centimeter, just shy of 2 centimeters in 20 or 30 years. So why should we care? Well, we should care for two reasons. One, because actually small amounts of sea level rise do matter, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But more importantly, because of the two bars that are shaded here. In the 1990s, they weren't contributing much to sea level rise, 2 millimeters per decade. And in the past decade, that's risen by a factor 6. And that's a concern because that could carry on accelerating and accumulate pretty rapidly into a very large sea level contribution. And why is that happening? So these are maps of Antarctica on the left and Greenland on the right, not to scale. Greenland's about a tenth the size of Antarctica, and showing the areas that are melting in red. And if I overlay the ocean temperature on top of it, this is what we've learned. The areas that are thinning are actually surrounded by a warm ocean. So it's not the air temperature that we need to be concerned about. That's minus 40 in the polar regions. It'll take a long time before we raise the air temperature up enough for them to melt. It's the ocean heat. And the ocean is at melting point because it's wet. And you only need to raise the ocean temperature by a small amount to disturb these glaciers. 1 degree centigrade of warming melts 10 meters of ice per year from a glacier. And that's enough to cause this progression of thinning that spreads inland into the ice sheets and is causing sea level rise. So it's small changes in ocean temperature which are responsible. Probably only about 0.5 degree centigrade too hot, and that's consistent with the temperature change that our planet has experienced. And this is the second reason we need to be concerned, and that's because we do have computer models of how Antarctica and Greenland will respond to climate change. This is one model of two of the biggest glaciers on Earth, the Pine Island and Thwaites glaciers in West Antarctica, and how they'll change over the next 200 or 300 years, and they'll continue to retreat. And because of their particular setup configuration, we can't stop that once we tip them into a progressive retreat. The only way we can stop it is by cooling the planet by a similar amount, and that's not about to happen soon. So what does that mean? It means, first of all, we have 30 years of satellite measurements which we can have confidence in now, but also we can start to compare them to these computer model predictions. So the total sea level rise has only been 15, 16 millimeters, but when we compare it to the IPCC's projections, we can see something quite interesting. First of all, those projections continue out into the future to cause greater amounts of sea level rise, but more importantly, the ice losses from the Antarctica and Greenland ice sheets are tracking the worst case scenario, the red line. That's not the one that most people are expecting, which is the orange line. And it means an extra 17 or so centimetres of sea level rise on average across the planet, over and above what people are predicting. And probably more in the Northern Hemisphere, because ice losses down south affect us more than they would if they occurred in the north. But we should probably expect about 20 centimetres more sea level rise. And why does that matter? Well, this is a good example. This is New York City in 2012 when Hurricane Sandy hit. And you have to stop thinking about sea level rise affecting Pacific Islands. This is a convenient diversion tactic to displace the concerned places where people don't tend to live in large numbers. This is New York City, and when Hurricane Sandy hit, it lasted for about 2 days, and it pushed sea levels up because of the storm surges, and at the time of the high tide, and because of the rainfall that fell at the same time. And at the time of high tide, what happened was the city flooded, and that flooded 50 square kilometres of downtown Manhattan, destroyed 20,000 basement homes, and killed 46 people as a consequence of the flooding. This is a tide gauge station on the Hudson River that was recording throughout that year, and you can see the spike at the end of October when the flood occurred. And sea level was much, much higher than it would usually be. But if you raise sea level by what we expect New York City to experience over the next century, plus this extra 20 centimetres, then that flooding happens perhaps 5 or 10 times per year instead of once every 5 years. And so it's the episodic flooding that is going to disrupt people's lives in a large way, not the inundation of small island nations. And everybody makes use of coastline, so this is going to happen all around the planet. This is our beautiful East Yorkshire coastline. We know it's eroding. Sea level rise doesn't just flood, it takes away land. And this is a real problem for places that we can't afford to defend. And it's going to be a big issue for the eastern coast of Yorkshire in the future. It already is. And it has economic impacts, not just because of the people's homes that are going to be lost in these caravan parks, but because of people's access to the coastline or coastal roads and our shipping. We receive a lot of goods through the Humber Estuary. And so this will cause us economic damage in the future, so we need to take it seriously. And if you look at the estimated number of people that are affected by coastal flooding around the planet, it's quite large, actually, much larger than you might expect. It's estimated that about 250 million people today are already at risk of annual floods once per year, but that number is set to rise to about 400 million over the next century. So that's just pushing us from today here up another 20 centimetres on the curve. And we bring an extra 50 or 100 million people into a situation of annual flooding just because of 20 centimetres of extra sea level rise. And 1 million of those people will be in the UK, and some of them will be in Yorkshire. So this is East Yorkshire today. This is the area that is already exposed to annual flooding in Yorkshire, and it's around the Humber Estuary. But if we change sea level progressively by 10 centimetres at a time, that pattern spreads, and we eventually get to a situation where by the end of the century, if we see 80 or more centimetres of sea level rise, not only does that affect the Humber Estuary and all the parts around it, but it starts to affect all of the coastline. You can't see it on this map because it's too thin. If I zoom into the northeast Yorkshire coast, Saltburn, where I take my son surfing every week, all along that coastline, the land is susceptible to sea level rise this century. So everywhere along this coastline, people have to pay attention and modify their flood risk maps. You might not live there, but you, like me, I'm sure, do make use of our coastline for recreation. And the people make use of it for their livelihoods as well. So it's an important thing, even though we live a long way from the sea. This is New York City. This is their plan for dealing with sea level rise. $10 billion. I don't think we have $10 billion. We can be expecting our government to spend $10 billion in North Yorkshire. And indeed, this flood defence plan in Manhattan is actually just for the central business district. If you look at the plan, it rather disgracefully ends beyond the central business district and is not protecting the coastlines where people actually live, which is a good example of where money gets invested if you leave it to the governments, unfortunately. So just to summarise Antarctica and Greenland, they're losing 7 trillion tonnes of ice per year. That's a lot of ice. That's 1,000 tonnes of ice per person on the planet each year. And the tonne of ice is a cubic metre, so it's going to take a lot to put that back. It's due to really ocean and atmosphere warming in equal measures. The ocean is triggering these glaciers to melt, and the atmosphere is melting Greenland to its surface. It's only caused 18 millimetres of sea level rise, but that's increased by a factor 6 and is set to continue to rise because we're tracking the worst case scenario of how the ice sheets will respond, which predicts another 17 centimetres by 2100. That's 80 centimetres in all, more in the northern hemisphere, and raises the annual flood risk to about 400 million people, some of them in the UK. So that's really all I wanted to say. It's a pretty bleak picture, but it's a really powerful motivation for people to try to do something about this, to avert this situation actually coming to pass. Thanks.
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you for some really clear graphics that explain the graphic situation that we're in. It's yeah, really challenging. Thank you, and thank you for bringing it down to us locally, because many of us know and love places just over the border into the sort of York area and the Yorkshire coastline, where we visit regularly. So thank you for that. I'm going to hand over to Kirsty, who has been fielding the questions, to take us on to our question time.
Great, thank you everybody. I'm sure I speak for everyone when I said that those 2 presentations were absolutely fascinating, and thank you very much for that. I've got some questions here which people who are here this evening submitted in advance. So I will start with some of those, but also I'm keeping my eye on some of the questions that people are putting into the chat. So so keep typing away. There will inevitably be quite an overlap. So if I just start, Andy, and pick up on a couple of things you said, if that's all right. Andy, somebody wrote in before and they said they'd seen a map of the Vale of York which showed it would be underwater by 2100 if we didn't act quickly enough. Is that in fact the case in the worst case scenario that you just mentioned?
So when I first started telling people about sea level rise, I did used to use the extreme situation of how, just to make people sit up, of how Earth would look if we melted all of the polar ice sheets. And it's interesting to reflect on the fact that I don't need to do that anymore, because even the real situation of 1 metre of sea level rise is going to affect people. So those predictions of the Vale of York being flooded are taking into account complete loss of the West Antarctic ice sheet, for instance, which would cause 5 metres of sea level rise or thereabouts. That's not going to happen anytime soon. It's not going to happen in our lifetimes. So we don't need to be concerned about 5 or 10 metres of sea level rise, but we do need to take seriously 1 metre of sea level rise. And it is also the case that, and there'll be some studies out, a study reported soon that I'm a co-author on, that we still don't know how to model Antarctica properly. It's still the biggest problem, how Antarctic ice losses might get out of control. And so we could expect tens of centimetres more from Antarctica. But actually, the Vale of York is today safe from coastal flooding over the next century, to our best knowledge. But the Humber Estuary is not. And in fact, this is only half of the problem anyway. I don't want you to forget about the real damage from floods that we have in Yorkshire, and even in my street on West End Avenue, thanks to the grammar school field, which comes from the sky. And that's our real risk of flooding. And that's absolutely going to continue to be a problem for the Vale.
That's really helpful to hear your answer on that. Thanks. And we'll come on to some of the things that that both yourself, Andy, and Piers think we should be able to do to take action and mitigate and adapt to some of those risks. But first, a question that somebody had submitted for Piers. Piers, in terms of thinking about the atmospheric side of things, if we're successful in achieving net zero emissions of carbon by 2030, do we also need to remove past CO2 emissions as well?
Well, I think because that talk was quite depressing, Andy, I need to have a glass of kind of wine now. But yeah, so that is correct. We absolutely do, and we have to really do everything. Because every ton of carbon dioxide we emit, it does make the temperature change and the sea level change worse. And if we want to reverse that at all, we have to begin removing carbon dioxide. But we're going to have to begin to remove it anyway, because there are sectors of the economy like agriculture and like aviation where we think we really can't reduce emissions all the way to zero. So we have to plant woodland, and we have to perhaps do geological carbon capture as well, where we do things like bioenergy and carbon capture, and put the carbon in old oil wells, and to try and offset some of the effects of agriculture and aviation. But if we are successful in doing that, we could perhaps go on and do a bit more of that to try and begin to reverse the surface temperatures. But I don't think we can really rely on that, because we can't do that indefinitely. When we planted the woodland, we can't go on putting in more and more woodland everywhere, because we have to do other things as well. And we can't necessarily can fill up all the oil wells. So I think also we can't really rely on that technology, and we have to do everything we can to get our own emission to come down.
Great, thanks for that answer, Piers. And there's a question, Marion Kempson, are you able to ask your question directly to Piers? Marion had a question about policies.
Is it in the chat, or is it not in the chat?
Hi, yes. So yeah, so you mentioned, Piers, that there's been some successful policies that appear to have reduced the projected temperature rise. I'd just be interested to hear a bit more about what those policies, what those policies are.
Sure. Yeah, because in fact that's a really straightforward thing to answer. It's almost exclusively only from one thing, and that is the reduction in the use of coal. So practically all the benefit we've seen to date have just come from people not burning so much coal and choosing to burn either natural gas instead. So that is almost exclusively.
So it's kind of a one-off benefit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But that's why I said that is really why we have to go on to that now, and we have to do other things. Like we have to, of course, build more renewable energy, but we also have to really begin to change people's behaviour now too.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, great, thanks very much. And linked to that and following on really, a question that came in advance of the session. People were very interested in the notion of carbon budgets, and Piers, you mentioned that. So would you be able to just explain what a carbon budget is and what that means for Harrogate District?
Yes, I can, but that's an awful question. Cheers, guys. Well, because there are different sorts of carbon budgets, but what I would talk about is the one that we come up with on the Committee for Climate Change, and that is really a 5-yearly emission reduction target. So what the committee touching that is beginning from a 1990 baseline, we set a 5-year percentage emission reduction target. So we say we have to be 20% down, 25% down, 30% down. So that is the way we can calculate it. And I think that is the best way to think about it. So if you want to set yourself a target of 0 at some further point, you have to set yourself a trajectory to get to that point.
Great, that's really interesting. And I know those of you who haven't seen, on the Zero Carbon Harrogate website, we've got a link to a report from PCAN, the Place-Based Climate Action Network, which also refers to the Harrogate share of the global carbon budget. And that estimates that if we carry on with business as usual, our share of the carbon budget will have gone through it within fewer than 10 years.
Well, I would say that is a slightly different budget than I did talk about. There are two different uses of the term carbon budget. The Committee on Climate Change that I work for, it does use the percentage reduction, and we call that budget. The other one is something I don't work on, and that's called the remaining carbon budget, which is what you try and apportion the total remaining carbon budget before we pass 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees. You have to try and portion that out per country or per town or per individual to try and determine what amount of that you are responsible.
That's a really helpful explanation. It's just as well we've got two world-class scientists in this room to help explain so clearly to us. Thank you very much for that. Okay, and then following on from that, there's been some discussion in the chat about consumption emissions. Piers, are you the best person to address those two, or would that be Andy?
I'm quite happy for Andy to do it if he wants to be saying no, he doesn't. Yeah, in fact, there's a lot of talk about consumption emissions, but if you look at them in the UK, and it's something that we are experts in at the University of Leeds, because we actually do calculate them for the UK government. So they are beginning to come down, in fact, in the UK. So because a lot of the consumption is within our own country. And the other thing is the rest of the world is beginning to decarbonize. So provided everybody in the world to really get onto this kind of 2-degree pathway, and in fact we're looking at China in particular, they perhaps aren't so concerning, but we do all have to reduce our consumption.
Thank you. And there's another thread coming up in the chat as well around agriculture and emissions from agriculture. Piers, I know you mentioned them. Ian Murray, I notice you're the last person to contact, so if Ian Murray wants to ask his question, that would be great. Have we got Ian Murray? No.
Hello, yeah, I'm here. I'm just trying to figure out how to use this. No, just one of the other participants mentioned or asked the question actually before me about whether or not permanent pasture should be incentivised or even pasture creation to capture carbon. But I think my sort of reply was, well, if we create pasture, that implies we take it out of arable food production, which means less food. So that's a bit of a difficult one. So maybe we could actually manage arable soils better to increase soil organic carbon and organic matter levels. It doesn't necessarily have to be changed over into grassland. So it wasn't really a question, it was me sort of coming back to somebody else who had asked the question.
Yeah, perhaps I can quickly comment on that. So we do have to kind of change agriculture in the UK. We have to really reduce the number of hairy cattle and the number of sheep in particular, but we don't have to do it hugely, only by about 15 or 20%. So we're not looking at big changes, but that is the way of growing more crops, because a lot of the crops we grow currently, they're not for human consumption, they're to kind of feed the cattle. So we do have to slightly change that. And we do think if we do have more productive agriculture, but on not quite as much area, we can still have enough agricultural land that goes over to either bioenergy type crops or grow to planting woodland. So we think the landscape does have to change, particularly in the Yorkshire Dales, which has a really tiny fraction of woodland can cover. Only about 4 or 5% of it is covered in woodland currently. So I think that's a real opportunity to change.
Great, thank you very much. And a question has come for Andy. This is not a local question. Ian Hallett, would you like to ask your question to Andy?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Kirsty. Yeah, I was just interested when we were talking about the snow melt around the ice caps. If Andy could comment on snow melt around mountain ranges around the world. You know, so if you think about northern Afghanistan, northern India, where these regions are fed by constant streams coming down from high mountainous regions, if you see melting of those snow caps, you're going to disrupt that steady water supply. So I wonder what sort of effects you thought that might have.
So we've just rerun the sea level projections for the next century for land ice, which includes mountain glaciers. And they're quite well behaved mountain glaciers just because they only interact with the atmosphere. It's when the ocean starts to melt glaciers that things become a bit difficult to predict. So we're quite good at predicting how they will respond to air temperature changes in terms of melting at least. And we think that it won't be long before the ice losses from Antarctica and Greenland overtake mountain glaciers in total. They'll continue to lose ice and it will be at an increasing rate, but nothing like as large as Antarctica and Greenland over the next century. But that doesn't mean it's still not a significant contribution. So they're already today about half of all sea level rise. And it's also the case that it disrupts the local water supply, which is the thrust of your question. One of the problems that we have with mountain glaciers still is translating ice melting into sea level rise, because we don't really know the route that the water will take to the ocean and how much of it will get stored in ground aquifers and how much of it will get taken by people for agriculture and for other purposes. So those are the things that we have to try and predict, and some of it is quite speculative. But definitely the hydrological cycle is already disrupted in places like high mountain Asia. And that means that the melting season is occurring sooner, starting sooner, which means that farmers have to be on their toes. They have to change their agricultural patterns because they have to plant different crops at different times of year because the temperature isn't keeping up and it's too cold to plant the crops that they used to plant. So it's disrupting people's lifestyles already, and it will cause even more disruption in the future. Not to us because we don't rely on snow melt, but to those people around the world that do. And when you look at the water tower regions, as they're called, it's a huge population which depend upon meltwater or not in one form or another around the planet. It's just not people in predominantly Western civilizations.
Thank you, Andy. That was a really thorough answer. And just in the interest of time, I'm going to move us on to thinking more locally now, very much about Harrogate district. So we've had some of the global climate science and thinking about how that will impact on us here, and thinking particularly for now about the notion of a green economic recovery. Piers, it was brilliant that you said it was not going to be an expensive investment. I feel really heartened by that. And I've got several questions that people had put in. One of them linked to the recent publication, the 10-point plan from the Climate Coalition. They mentioned that building on the Green Homes Grant, the government scheme, would deliver 300,000 jobs. Do you have an opinion on what skills would be required locally for some of those jobs to be in the Harrogate district?
Yeah, there's all sorts of different jobs. So I mean, that Teal can currently, if you look at the options under it, and I would encourage everyone to go and get their free £5,000 from the government, because it's fantastic. So you can get your home insulated, and you can get people putting on kind of PV panels and home insulation, of course, and then you can get air source heat pumps and things, so the installers. But there's also the expertise. So we do need a lot more experts to be able to come in to our Victorian properties and to evaluate them and to really kind of tell us kind of what we ought to be doing and the best options. And we do then need to have people to come in and really make sure things are done effectively, and really make sure that these installation plans and the other thing we do are really built to the good regulations and the regulations enforced. So there's those sort of jobs. So there are some are more mechanical jobs, but there are some more kind of highly skilled jobs in there too, and there's a huge amount of jobs. And then the other thing is there are more jobs in technology for constantly recording things. So to have effective climate policies, we have to have really good data about what works and what doesn't work. So there are good creative roles for app designers and things to really come in and look at the best way of trying to record all this data and understand it. So those sort of quite kind of technical and exciting jobs. There are also a lot of jobs about kind of putting creation jobs and things too. That's quite a practical outdoor activity that people can do today to get to the great outdoors. But then there's a whole set of things about education, and I think we have to almost think differently about the way we do all our jobs. So the way we do online shopping, of course, will change, and perhaps we will have more of a kind of supply chain within the community. So think about that as well. But then we have to really kind of redesign our towns. If we're not going to have all these town centres like they were before, we're going to have other things to do there. We can think about that. So there are lots of jobs in the creative industries to try and really imagine really and communicate what's the society we want to turn our society into. And we need to do that over a relatively short time. So we need to really think about that, what we do to affect the change.
Thank you. And if I can bring Jenny Tropia in, who's got an interesting question about affecting change. Jenny. Hi, Jenny. Jenny Tropia.
Hello, sorry. I'm a primary school teacher. This is something we've been talking about with the children. I wondered what kind of advice I could get from you about what we could be doing to best affect changes.
I'm going to ask that one to Andy, because he's much more of a little child than me.
Okay, well, the first thing is to convince people, kids, right, that science is still fun and that there are still things to discover. There was a really nice story in the paper today about a firm in Sheffield, Metalysis, and you might have seen it. They're basically a spin out of the steel industry. I'm from Sheffield a long time ago. The steel industry closed down a long time ago and left. Highly specialised fabrication only, but Metalysis have just been awarded a contract. They specialise in extracting metals from rocks, and they've been awarded a contract to build the oxygen power plant on the moon by the European Space Agency, which is a fantastic outcome. And there are still important things that even people from scientists and teams from Yorkshire can be involved in that make a difference to people's lives. And there are solutions out there that we didn't know that existed yesterday. So one of the problems we just talked about jobs. We've got to replace 11 million gas boilers in the UK at some point, right? And somebody's got to come up with a reasonable alternative that most people will buy into that doesn't involve electric storage alone. And there's no space on my street, in my garden, should I say, and I suspect not many of yours, for a ground heat pump because we just don't have the land in Harrogate. So somebody's going to have to invent solutions. I've started in all of my talks now, except for the one I gave you guys tonight, because it was for short, to dwell at the end of them and tell people what you can do to make a difference and what problems still need to be solved. And kids like to hear that because they want to think that they can make a difference.
Great. Thanks very much, Andy. Jenny, is there anything you wanted to ask as a follow-up on that?
No, that was great. Thank you. I like the idea of making science as fun. That's a big thing that we do. So thank you for that.
But I would also add to that, you can go outside too and plant trees and things, and you can understand the way that trees kind of work. That's something I do with a lot of kids, and they have a great time, and they understand all the wonderful benefits that I can bring people with too. And they can also talk about getting on their kind of bicycles rather than coming to a kind of car. So you can explain what effect that has and why it's very important to come to school, you know, and all these sort of things.
Thank you.
Just a short one that came up. Andy, if you want to answer it or pass over to Piers, what role do you think biofuels or bioenergy will have in the future of Harrogate District as one of the solutions?
I think Piers knows more about this than I do, but I don't think it's a great long-term solution to change over our arable land to energy production in that way. I think we have to think of something else to do with our land. We need it more for other things.
Yeah, it is, but I think well, the community on climate change thing is quite important in the kind of short term, and it's particularly important because we want to invent, or we want to try and get this bioenergy and carbon capture technology working, and we do have to have some bioenergy production to try and get that technology to work. So if we do combine it with carbon capture, we can potentially begin to work that technology. But if we don't combine it, then it can only be good use in the shorter term.
Okay, thank you. I'm just going to go back up the chat line. Neil Swift, you put in a question a while ago about data. Do you want to ask that one?
Hi there. Sorry, there's a big lag on the mute. Yeah, I was just wondering, in terms of any initiatives that we do in Harrogate, measuring their effectiveness, is there any local data which would help to do that?
Yeah, I mean, it's been fantastic. For this work we did on kind of Corona, we really did make advantage of the data we had from Google, which was really disaggregated down to the communities, and we tried to talk to them afterwards about trying to get that data for everywhere all the time, and they did almost give it to us. We got through to the headquarters in California, and we had some discussion with the people in charge, but at the last minute they changed their mind and they decided they weren't going to give it to us after all. So I think that data collection can really affect what we do and determine what works and what doesn't work. And the other thing it can do, and the other thing we need to do from it, we don't only need to collect it, we need to really communicate it. So a lot of good people are trying to change things everywhere in all parts of the country and other countries. They're trying to affect change to see what kind of solutions work and what solutions do not work. And the people don't really learn from others that effectively. So often people invent things and they try the same things and they don't work again. So we need to have some way of not only collecting it, but some way of communicating between everyone working everywhere about what interventions work and what interventions do not work. So I think we've got to do a much better job on not only collecting it, but really sharing it, understanding it.
Great, thank you. And then we'll just take a question from Bill and Shan Oakes about their shopping list while we're thinking about solutions. Bill and Shan, do you want to ask yours?
Hi there. Hello there. Yeah, I was just asking about the shopping list for actions that councils can take. Is there one that the University of Leeds has put together for all councils perhaps, or something that we can learn from other councils who are trying to educate all their citizens?
Yeah, well, you're speaking about the work that our colleague does, Andy Coulson, and this is the sort of data that he provides on what different councils and communities can do to decarbonize, and I keep on trying to convince him to do something quite generic that he can distribute everywhere, but for some reason he doesn't want to do that. He wants to keep it all kind of personal. So yeah, so it would be fantastic to persuade him to give something more kind of generic that would work for everyone. So
I second that. The problem with scientists, and Andy Coulson's not on his own, is that we've all been brought up in an era where you hold on to your science because your pursuit of science is really not in anybody else's interests. It turns out now that actually what we're working on matters to a lot of people, and it's much more important to disseminate your knowledge than to hold on to it. And it would be really powerful if people could check their own local or regional carbon budgets and see how to decarbonise rather than having to contact a scientist at a particular university.
Kirsty, if I could respond, I'm the other half of the Bill and Sean industry here. What our work example is in our little road here of 20 or so houses, and I really would like an opportunity to be able to engage with my neighbours and say, look, each of us, each year, don't forget we've only got 9 years to 2030. It's not 2021 is coming any minute now. What we could do to in a sense turn the lights on house by house down our road, which is ordinary 50s dwellings, which, you know, replicated over the country millions of times. And I'd like us to be a sort of success story for a zero carbon street, so to speak. And we would need to be able to access all sorts of things, you know, information, builders, advice, and all of that, so that one by one we could change them all. I mean, the neighbours, we all get on really well, and throughout lockdown, in fact, we've become a really very strong community. And there is an opportunity here to sort of house by house make the change in time for 2030.
That's fantastic, yeah, and I would strongly encourage you to try and do that, and perhaps then not only to do it effectively, but then when you have done that, to really try and communicate it everywhere. So I think you have to do the two, and yeah, I think whatever we can do to kind of support you guys to make that kind of work, that sounds fantastic.
Great. Thank you.
I was going to say, Kirsty, can I just jump in there in terms of data for the Harrogate district, because Andy Goulson is another Harrogate resident, so we're very fortunate in Harrogate. And just to defend Andy, because he's not here to defend himself, he has actually written a roadmap paper for the Harrogate district, which he's put together for the Harrogate District Climate Change Coalition, which they're using to put together a action plan for decarbonisation for the district at the moment. So I think we will be hearing more about that in the future. But Andy has done us some stats and some pointers. So.
Yeah, thank you, Jemima. And I think, I'm not sure if there's anyone here representing Harrogate Borough Council, but both the Borough Council and North Yorkshire County Council do monitor carbon emissions based on government BEIS data and some of the DEFRA figures. Obviously, the challenge is in disaggregating it enough to seem more meaningful to those of us on the ground. But just a last question for Piers, unless Andy, it may be more appropriate for you. We've talked about climate change and mitigation. Is there anywhere we should go to look for good practice examples about adaptation and resilience, and how perhaps we might respond in the Harrogate district?
Perhaps I can begin, and Andy can chip in, and does you want to go first? Yeah, so adaptation is currently the really kind of poor cousin of mitigation action. So each council is supposed to come up with an adaptation plan, but they don't have any real resources to do that effectively. And they don't have the expertise, so it's been challenging. And it's something we try and coordinate again at the Committee for Climate Change, and we try and put the government to account, but they haven't really done anything. And yeah, and it's because with the net zero target, they have to come up with choose to Parliament and why they don't achieve their targets, but they really don't have to explain themselves at all about adaptation. So there isn't really anyone holding the government to account. So, but that might change, but we have to get that to change. But we try and coordinate it as the Committee for Climate Change, but it isn't kind of working at all well now.
Okay, thank you. And really helpful to have that national perspective from you there, Piers, but I'm going to get all local because we only have a few minutes left. So I'm just going to address a final question to Jemima, and then I know Jemima has a bit of news that she wanted to share with us. Jemima, I know that Zero Carbon Harrogate is working collaboratively behind the scenes with all sorts of local organisations and businesses. Can you tell us, please, what you see as some of the priorities for Zero Carbon Harrogate and the rest of us for local action?
Thank you, Kirsty. Yes, in terms of local action, we know that as a district, nearly half of our emissions, about 44% of our emissions, come from transport. And so we will be working with our different local authorities, Harrogate Borough and North Yorkshire, who have responsibility for transport, pushing for a strategic plan in terms of decarbonising transport, looking at how our road space is used and looking at how we might move towards more active travel and better public transport in the longer term. So transport is a key area for us. We're also aware that in order to make significant change, we need, as Piers and Andy have said, to have everybody on board. We need to have much more engagement in adapting and mitigating to climate change. So we will be working hard to engage particularly with businesses who are the folk who determine many of our lives, our actions, because not everybody is going to be able to take on board actions for climate change because they're busy just coping with their own everyday lives. But the businesses who provide their services and the products that they're buying can decarbonise, and we're aware that there are some really good case studies or examples of businesses who are managing that. So we're looking to do more engagement on that front. And then looking at our homes, again, heating and using energy in our homes is a really significant proportion of our where our carbon emissions come from. And as well as looking at that piece around retrofitting and making our homes much more energy efficient by insulation and getting us off gas and oil heating onto things like air source heat pumps. We've also been working with a group of different local community groups who are concerned about the large number of new homes that are going to be built across the district in the next 10 to 15 years. And I'm sure many of you will have seen new developments going up. And those developments need to be zero carbon homes. It's shocking that they're being built to such poor standards at the moment, and they will all need to be retrofitted within a short number of years unless we take action on them now. So there's a piece coming out in a week or so from that coalition called the Campaign for Sustainable Developments, and I'd encourage you to get behind that to press for more sustainable new build homes in our area. And you can find out all about this and more in the vision and strategy document, which we mentioned at the beginning, which you'll find on our website if you haven't already had the opportunity to see it. So do please take a read through that, because it's got a lot more detail in it than I have just mentioned in this short time slot, because there's food and tree planting and energy generation as well for us to cover too. So a whole spread of different things that we need to be taking action on.
Great, thank you very much, Jemima. I'll hand over to Clive to do the formal thank yous to everybody.
Well, thank you, Kirsty, and thank you, Jemima, and especially a big thank you to Piers and Andy for their fabulous presentations. I have learnt so much tonight, and there is always more to learn on climate change. So big round of virtual applause, please, for our speakers and for everybody that's been involved in putting tonight's climate forum together. I have to say, I'm left with a lingering thought about the importance of sea level rises. Some years ago, I almost bought a cottage down by the harbour in Sea Houses, and I actually woke up the following day with a vision of the storm coming into the harbour. And I actually went onto YouTube and searched for storm in Sea Houses harbour, and I found a picture of all those lovely wooden kiosks floating around the side of the harbour, and that was from a few years ago. So when we think of sea level rises and we think of the water just rising, really tonight's presentation has left me with how important it is to just remember the added effects of storms and hurricanes and all sorts of other weather conditions. Climate change is really something that we need to prioritise, and I really would add my weight to Jemima and Kirsty to commend the vision and strategy document on the Zero Carbon Harrogate website. I've read through it word for word, cover to cover, and it is fabulous. I would commend it to all of you. So on behalf of UNA Harrogate and everybody here, just thank you all again for attending. We'll get the recording put onto the website as soon as we possibly can. And I wish you a pleasant evening. Good night to everybody.